Top of the morning to you. Welcome to our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. I'm Olumide Macaulay. The headlines: 32,000 Russian prisoners who fought for the Wagner group in Ukraine have completed their tour and returned home. South Africa President Cyril Ramaphosa describes Africa peace mission to Russia and Ukraine as impactful. European Union says it's accelerating arms shipment to Ukraine. Thank you so much for joining us. The Wagner Group boss, Yevgeny Prigozhin, says 32,000 former Russian prisoners have returned home after the end of their contracts with the mercenary militia group Wagner ended their fighting in Ukraine. According to him, 83 crimes were committed by those who gained their freedom and returned to Russia, which he claims was 80 times less than the number committed by those released from prison over the same period without having served with Wagner. Prigozhin toured Russian prisons to recruit fighters, promising pardons if recruits survived a half-year tour of frontline duty with Wagner. In an interview last month, Prigozhin says he recruited 50,000 convicts, about 10,000 of whom were killed in Bakhmut. An African peace mission on the Ukraine war that failed to spark enthusiasm from either Moscow or Kiev was still impactful, according to South Africa's President Cyril Ramaphosa. A day after the delegation visited St. Petersburg, Russian news agencies quoted the Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov as saying that President Vladimir Putin showed interest in the 10-point plan presented by African leaders, but that it will be difficult to realize. In Kiev the previous day, Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky told the African delegation, the first since the start of the war, to hold separate face-to-face talks with both leaders on their peace initiative, that allowing negotiations now will just freeze the war and the suffering of the Ukrainian people. However, Mr. Ramaphosa cast the trip to Ukraine and Russia in positive light, tweeting on Sunday, "The Africa Peace Initiative has been impactful, and its ultimate success will be measured on the objective, which is stopping the war." It says the Africans will keep talking to President Putin and President Zelensky and will brief United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres on their efforts so far.
Well, I think our mission was impactful. Its real success obviously will be measured on the ultimate objective of stopping the war. But the impact that it has had is that, one, we were listened to as we gave an African perspective on the war that's having negative consequences for our continent. And secondly, we probably the only group that has engaged the two leaders within a short space of time to put forward a very strong proposal and view that the war must end. But we also accompanied that broad proposal with a number of elements which have to do with the recognition of the sovereignty of countries in terms of the UN Charter. That we put forward unambiguously, and we spoke about the de-escalation of the conflict. We also added that the humanitarian assistance must get to the people who are suffering in the war. And part of that must be about the release of prisoners of war, as well as the release of the children who were taken out of Ukraine and to be returned back. Now, those are some of the key issues, but we also spoke about the release and the opening up of the Black Sea for movement of grains and fertilizers to the world markets, which is where we are impacted quite negatively. But I think the most important outcome of these discussions was, one, the willingness to talk initially to us, and the other one is the willingness to go through the various issues that we raised, and the commitment that we will engage further. And as it is now, the continent, Africa, is going to have a summit with Russia, which is the second summit, the first one having been held a few years ago. And we will continue our discussions with President Putin then. And in the intervening period, we'll also be talking to President Zelensky, because we also want to know his response to a number of the other issues we raised. So overall, much as this was not going to end the war, it is one of those engagements, and many other people and parties are having engagements with Russia and Ukraine on the war. We're the first one to see them almost jointly, but one after the other. So their agreement that they are willing to engage with African leaders on this is a huge achievement for us, because now Africa is in the frame. Africa will be participating, and we're participating positively without trying to diminish the other efforts that are underway. And we will also be talking to the UN Secretary General and informing him about these talks, including many other world leaders. That's what I will be doing as well.
President of South Africa, Mr. Cyril Ramaphosa. Meanwhile, he was in Russia as part of the peace-seeking delegation, and he did tell his Russian counterpart, Vladimir Putin, that the war in Ukraine must stop. President Ramaphosa laid out the 10 points of the African Peace Initiative that is seeking agreement on a series of confidence-building measures, as they described it, even as Ukraine last week began the counter-offensive to push back Russian forces. In his words, he also says that the war has to have an end. It must be settled through negotiations and through diplomatic means. The war is having a negative impact on the African continent and indeed on many countries around the world. In response to that, Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov says the Ukraine peace plan put forward by African leaders is difficult to realize. He says, in his words, any initiative is very difficult to implement, and that President Putin has shown interest in considering it after the leaders held the meeting behind closed doors. Russia's Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov says the plan was not formulated on paper. Elsewhere, a Russia-installed official says Ukrainian forces have captured the village of Piaty-Kyatki in the Zaporizhzhia region, and it's a rare admission from the Russian side that it lost ground in Ukraine. He says the Ukrainian forces managed to take it under their own control. Ukrainian troops were able to take the territory in spite of suffering colossal losses during waves of attacks, with hundreds of Ukrainian soldiers killed. There was no confirmation from the Ukrainian military. Meanwhile, Russia's defense ministry says its forces have repelled a series of Ukrainian attacks across 3 sections of the front line. Now, the ministry also says Kyiv was pressing most actively in the Zaporizhzhia region. Agencies could not immediately, independently verify battlefield reports. Statement did not mention the settlement of Piaty-Kyatki in the Zaporizhzhia region, which the Russian installed official says earlier had been taken by Ukraine. Now we're speaking with Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of a publication in Ukraine, who joins us from that region. It's good to have you with us on the program this morning.
Good morning. It's a pleasure to join you.
Let's begin with the return of the mercenaries who were convicts and who worked for the Wagner Group. So I'm a mercenary. I've joined Wagner Group. I was a convicted criminal, possibly a violent crime, possibly doing 20 years, 30 years to life, a violent criminal. I've done my tour of duty with the Wagner Group. Now I'm returning with 32,000 other compatriots who have a free pass to go home. So the government has made good on its end of the bargain to return these convicts back home. But we did see earlier in the war that for those who did return, some of them went back to the same crimes for which they were convicted. Your thoughts?
Well, the recruitment of criminals is a very controversial policy for any government, and it's not hard to see why. First of all, they can rarely be trusted to follow orders, let's say, from a military point of view. So obviously there are issues with having people convicted of serious crimes placed in the army. That's a very extreme measure. That has military implications for Russia and Ukraine, but now it has implications for Russian society, because large numbers of Russians who were convicted of very serious crimes, and it's worth underlining that those who fought in Ukraine typically were convicted of crimes of the caliber of murder, of violent sexual crime, of serious physical assault. These are people serving long sentences who were offered the chance to commute their sentence, to cancel their sentence in exchange for the service they would provide the Russians in Ukraine, for going to Ukraine and fighting. So these people are serious criminals. They're not minor criminals. They're not technical criminals or people who were involved in a little bit of trouble. They're very serious criminals who are now being freed into Russian society. Now, of course, some of them may be people who've reformed, who've changed, but a large number of them probably won't be. So I think we will see a large number of criminal cases relating to them in Ukraine, in Russia. There already are a number of them. As always with anything in Russia, we don't know the exact numbers because the Russians won't release the exact numbers. So we can expect that to be covered up to a degree. But the Russian people will see this, and I think there will be a phenomenon in Russian society in the coming years of the Wagner veterans, that they will be seen as a dangerous element in society. Much the same way, in some respects, in fact, as those who fought for the Soviet army in Afghanistan came to be seen as a very important element of the lawlessness that then engulfed Russia in the 1990s. The so-called Afghansi, the people who served in Afghanistan, were notorious for their close involvement, in particular, in organized crime, for example.
To the Africa Peace Initiative, to which the president of Russia has said through his spokesman, difficult to realize, but he didn't say impossible. Now, for those who are dubious of its impact because of the sheer veracity of that proposition to stop the war, don't the African leaders get an A for effort? These gentlemen left their countries, they hopped on the plane to go to a war zone to try to mediate. They were there in person. What's your impression?
I think, first of all, it should be noted that, yes, they did come personally. They could have sent envoys or held an event in Africa itself. They didn't. They chose to come to Ukraine. They chose to come to Russia. They spoke directly with all the key people. So that is certainly very significant. Now, I would also note that it's historic, that we've never seen an African peace proposal that has been related to a non-African conflict, that a non-African war. This is the first time, to my knowledge, that the leaders of Africa have come together to try and engage in global affairs at this level. So it's unprecedented. It's impressive and unprecedented in a number of ways. And I think it does reflect also how big the Ukraine conflict is, how big this Russian invasion, what a big impact it has on the wider world, and why it is not seen as a local conflict, why it is not seen as a local affair, whereas perhaps For example, the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008 was very much seen as a local affair. It was not seen as something for the international community to become overly concerned with, let's say. Now we see the opposite here, and the African Peace Initiative is a good example of that. We've also, in recent months, or earlier this year, saw China for the first time seek to involve itself directly in the peace process of essentially a European war. So this is a war that is changing, that is rewriting the rule book in terms of international diplomacy. It's showing a much more global approach. We've had other initiatives from Brazil, for example. But certainly, I think the African initiative stands out because it is multilateral, because it involves a number of different countries, and because they have physically come to Ukraine to try and promote this initiative. They've come to Russia. They've put their money where their mouth is, as we say. They've not just sat and issued declarations, but they've come to a war zone. Kiev, however safe, relatively safe Kiev may feel, it is a war zone. It is under threat. Russia bombed the city during their visit, so we shouldn't underestimate the impact of this and the reality of that threat in terms of the significance of the visit. So yeah, definitely a significant visit, definitely an important precedent for international diplomacy. But of course, the results still we have to wait and see.
Indeed, Mr. Dickinson, one tends to measure success by way of results. It's a very good idea, and it's fantastic that they came together to do this. But what leverage did they have? We are the ones in Africa who need the grain. What leverage did we bring to the table? Because in negotiations, there's something that has to do with influence, leverage, and how much of power that you can wield, or authority, or leverage, if that's a better word, for both parties to even consider what you're saying. One of their propositions is that for Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine. That's one of the propositions in that peace plan.
Yes, that was one of the aspects of the plan that was certainly welcomed in Ukraine, and I'm sure much less in Russia. It's very hard to say how much leverage any partner has. I think, of course, if you did a global scale, then probably you would assume America is at the top, followed by China, and it would be very much a power scale in terms of global influence. But I think African leaders have some significant scale. I think the fact that they came personally increases the influence they have. The fact that it's unprecedented, it increases the influence they have. And the fact that Africa is viewed as unaligned in this conflict, whereas obviously the West stands with Ukraine to a lesser degree, but certainly significantly. A lot of the countries in the non-Western world, the major countries, have aligned themselves closer to Russia, either by taking a pro-Russian neutral position or by openly defending Russia's position. So I'm thinking here of Brazil, of India, of China. Now Africa is in between these countries. Africa has done a much better job of maintaining neutrality. Again, there are perceptions in the West and in Ukraine, certainly, that Africa leans more toward Russia for a variety of reasons, certainly for anti-colonial sentiment, which is understandably very strong, for anti-Western sentiment, which is related to the colonial past, which does still influence, of course, very many people in Africa in terms of their perceptions of the wider world and in terms of their views of where the world needs to go. So there are a number of reasons why, some do see Africa as more in Russia's camp, broadly speaking, but they're not seen as directly, they're certainly not seen as allies of Russia. And it's also noted that Russia is investing a lot of time and money in the past year to court Africa, to promote its relations with Africa. Russia's relations with the West are ruined. They're in a very difficult situation with China, where they have close ties, but they're very dependent on China. They're trying to develop a new aspect, a new wing, as it were, of their foreign policy with much closer ties with the African nation. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov has spent a significant portion of the last year in Africa, traveling around, trying to underline this. So I think African leverage over Russia is seen as significant, that Africa has the chance to use its voice there. And when Africa says things like Russia needs to withdraw out of Ukraine and Russia needs to pull back and we need to end this war. The Russians can't really afford to completely ignore that. It might not make them act immediately, but it will certainly be a factor in their thinking.
Do you think it's played some sort of role, the fact that South Africa has a closer tie with Russia than most other African countries, and they've been accused of not condemning the war in the hardest possible terms? And of course, you remember the controversy concerning the shipment of arms found on a ship. That matter is still under investigation. That the same country, South Africa, is actually spearheading this peace initiative. How do you think it went with Ukraine? Zelensky knowing this, and maybe that's one of the reasons why he says that calling for a ceasefire of some sorts will just freeze the war. What's wrong with freezing the war at this time? And do you think that South Africa's position was compromised from the get-go because of their relationship with Russia, thereby rubbing Ukraine the wrong way?
Well, certainly South Africa's relationship with Russia is well known in Ukraine and is treated with suspicion, certainly. But so is China's. So are many countries. Ukrainians understand they can't only talk to countries that don't like Russia, of which there are many. But of course, there are many who also seek to develop profitable relationships with Russia, who have long historic ties with Russia. That's the nature of international relations. So it's certainly a factor. It will have colored the opinion in Ukraine, in Kiev, and President Zelensky personally about the entire mission, certainly. So it's had an impact, but I don't think we can talk, it's not realistic to expect Ukraine to only have dealings with those countries which are emphatic in their condemnation of Russia. It's vital to understand Ukraine's position here. You need to see where the conflict is at today. You have Russia in possession of approximately 20% of Ukraine, just slightly less than 20% of the whole country. Now, if we have a ceasefire today or in the near future, part of that ceasefire will de facto leave that territory under Russian control. So we have a scenario where Ukraine is, we talk about a ceasefire in terms of stopping the killing and peace, creating peace, which obviously are attractive ideas. But if we talked about the ceasefire saying, listen, we can stop this, all you've got to do is give away 20% of your country, I think very, very, very few people will be prepared to do that in Ukraine or anywhere else. That it becomes a much less attractive proposition. And the idea that Russia can be convinced to end the war now while it's in possession of 20% of Ukraine, and they can then be convinced without force to surrender that 20%, which it controls, seems very, very far-fetched. Ukrainians know Russians very well. They understand the Russian government and mentality, and they understand ceasefire proposals of this nature. They read them as surrender proposals. They're basically being asked to surrender a large part of their country, and they won't do that. So I think the thing in Ukraine, the Ukrainians would say, and certainly I think this is a valid comment, that it's not accurate to talk about these things as peace proposals or ceasefires. They're basically surrenders. They're proposals for Ukraine to surrender, and Ukraine has no intention of surrendering.
Indeed, a catch-22 situation. Thank you, Mr. Dickinson. Do you give them at least an A for effort?
I do. I'd be prepared to be generous. I think all efforts are welcome. I don't want to be cynical. Peace will eventually come through talks at some point when the circumstances are right. And I think it's great to see these leaders specifically coming physically to Ukraine. That's what we need to see more of.
Indeed. Thank you so much. Always a pleasure. Mr. Peter Dickinson, publisher of Business Ukraine, who joined us from that region, for coming on the program this morning.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Coming up after the break, death toll from the breach of the Kakhovka Dam rises. That's in a moment. Do join us again. Welcome back to our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine, and now we'll turn our attention to how the world of business is affected by the Ukrainian conflict and vice versa. Getting down to brass tacks with Ini John Mekwa joining me this morning. Ini.
Good morning.
Good morning. Now, Rishi Sunak had spoken recently saying that countries should, and business people should help concerning assets of Russians who are in their countries, something of that nature. But rebuilding Ukraine with Russia's seized assets. Now,
it's an act now. It's in the process.
So these are the
oligarchs.
These are the oligarchs. These are the billionaires who have assets all over the world. A great number of them have a lot of fortune in the UK.
Yes, they do. But, you know, this time it's in the United States. They call them a bipartisan group of the United States Congress. They've introduced what they call the REPO, R-E-P-O, and it means Rebuilding Economic Prosperity and Opportunity for Ukrainians Act.
Sorry, let me jump in. That's a tongue-in-cheek because repo also means for when you get into you repossess your goods that you didn't pay for.
In the United States.
So if you got a fridge and you're doing, or your mortgage, then they send the
then
repo man
repossess it if you cannot pay up your stuff. So I don't know if that's what they mean, but what it means here is rebuilding economic prosperity and opportunity. That's the REPO. Then for Ukrainians Act.
They're trying to be funny.
I don't know about that. So they said this is supposed to, you know, a lot of countries have been helping Ukraine one way or the other, aid and ammunition and all of that. But it also becomes a stress for them. So they're now thinking, apart from all of that, oligarchs you talked about, you know, Ukraine as a country, they have their about 300 billion assets seized. So they're trying to legalize the process of getting those funds, the money in dollars and all of that for Ukraine to be rebuilt. Now, they have started this conversation a long time ago, and a lot of questions have been asked. Do they have the right? Do individual countries have the right to take up a country's possession, a country's asset, you know, and use it without that country's consent? This is a big question, but I mean, it's all in dollars, and we know what's going on with the issue of dollar and de-dollarizing. That's one of the reasons why you have countries like China, you know, pushing for this, reducing the power of the dollar and the hold of especially the United States on a lot of countries. Because, I mean, if you talk of the World Bank, you talk of IMF, you talk of any of those things, it is the United States that's in control and controlling it. So if they go through with this Repo Ukraine for Ukrainians Act, and it goes through and they're able to take the seized assets of Russia and use it for what they think is the right thing, I mean, a lot of questions will be asked. Russia is supposed to be a sovereign country. It is their asset, you know. So what about the legal implications? So that means if Nigeria takes a decision that does not sit well with the West tomorrow, it little reserve. We cannot compare it to a Russia
precedent.
Yeah, exactly. So these are the questions and the fears, that are being raised concerning this.
So these are some of the sanctions for which President Cyril Ramaphosa was saying that in his peace plan, which we've been talking about before the break, that should be considered by both sides, that sanctions should be dropped. Now, going to that visit to
the African leaders?
Yes, of the African Peace Initiative to Ukraine and Russia, how does that come in with business?
Well, of course it comes in because a lot of the African countries who went for that visit, both to see President Zelensky and President Putin, they are waiting for grains from both grains, fertilizer, at least the components to make fertilizer from both Russia and Ukraine. It's the lifeline. It's the lifeline for countries like Egypt. It's a lifeline. They had to even create a subsidy for their food subsidy. It's a lifeline. So peace in Ukraine and Russia is very important.
For Africa.
For Africa, you know, for the world. But I mean, in this case, we see the Africans taking that initiative. Unfortunately, just as they were leaving Russia, there was a strike somewhere in Ukraine, which seems like that talk was actually not, because Putin had said, okay, we're ready to talk, but Ukraine is saying we will not talk to you until you leave our soil. And Russia is saying, oh, this war started long before now by the West, so we're just here, we're following what they have done. So it seems so difficult to have a meeting point. And next month is July. The brokered grain deal is coming to an end. Even as it is now, it's not as effective as it used to be, because Russia is insisting that their fertilizer and food is being hampered by the sanctions. Not directly, obviously, but I mean, because of logistics, insurance, ship, a lot of companies do not want to handle Russian commodities because of the fear of secondary sanction and, whatever. Nobody wants to get stuck. You invest your money or you start a transaction and you cannot finish it up because of sanction or because of a threat from the West. So already the grain deal is not as effective as it ought to be.
And Russia says it's not working, so they're going to pull out of it. Exactly.
And so it's a lot of risk also even on the Black Sea. If ships get there and they get bombed, it's a war. You don't know if it's Ukraine and nobody will take responsibility. I mean, even an insurance company cannot cover you in that kind of a situation, so it's a very dicey one, which I believe the African leaders looked at the implication that if this war continues, how do we get food security? Even if Africa wants to wake up today to start doing their wheat and doing their corn and all of that. I mean, look at Nigeria. We do produce corn, but we still import it because they say, okay, either a processing from the farm and all of that, we still have some insecticides or stuff like that.
Yeah.
So we still have to import corn. So you can also imagine other countries that are not even as big as Nigeria, and then issues like wheat. If you don't have the weather and the climate or the soil for it, you still have to import it. And these are the two giants in grains.
The global village of the world just keeps getting smaller. The war in Ukraine
keeps pushing.
To sum it up, is affecting and does continue to affect other countries. Thank you so much, Ini.
Thank you for having me.
Now, the Ukrainian Air Force carried out 14 airstrikes over the past day, hitting areas where enemy personnel are stationed. Ukraine's general staff said in a statement that their defenders also destroyed 2 anti-aircraft missiles. The statement also claimed that Ukrainian missiles and artillery struck 3 control points, 5 ammunition depots, and 3 artillery units in the past day. Russia is concentrating its war efforts in the directions of Liman, Bakhmut, Amarinka, and other areas. European Union Industry Chief Thierry Breton says the bloc is speeding up arms deliveries to Ukraine in support of the country's counteroffensive against Ukrainian forces. In his words, we're going to step up our efforts to deliver arms and ammunition. This is a war of high intensity in which they play a crucial role, Breton said in an interview with the French daily Le Parisien. He says, we are preparing for the war to last several more months or even longer. Now, joining us on the program is Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain, defense strategist, joining us from our Abuja studios. It's good to have you with us this morning. Good morning.
Good morning, Olumide. I'm sorry for the other day I was calling you Olamide, but your name is Olumide. So how you doing?
I'm good, thank you. No problem. Now, let's get to the issue concerning the start of the shifting of the weapons from Russia to Belarus, the tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus, the deployment of these weapons. Now, for those who are not savvy about how terrible Russian, nuclear arsenals are, it's because they're not aware of the widespread damage and impact that the deployment of a nuclear weapon is capable of achieving. Now that these weapons are being deployed to Belarus, and Russia says that they'll continue to do so, and there's no timeline for it, What are we to make of this issue?
Well, if you remember, the last time I was on this program, I told you that each of the parties in the conflict are going to do whatever it takes to strengthen their position so that they will get some leverage when it gets to negotiation. I don't see the Russians using that tactical nuclear weapon that they deployed in Belarus. I think these are all part of the strategy to be able to strengthen their position, to give them some leverage when they do eventually get to a negotiating table. That's what that is all about. Now, in terms of the fallout, should that be used, which I doubt is going to be used, the fallout may not be as more impactful as if it were a full-blown nuclear weapon. It will be limited mostly to the nearest vicinities. Not that it won't cause great harm. It will cause great harm, but not to the extent of what we saw in Hiroshima and Nagasaki.
What we saw in Hiroshima, for instance, was that at the instance of the Hiroshima bomb, 70,000 people lost their lives. 70,000 people immediately died, not to talk of the corresponding damage and the hundreds of thousands of people that suffered as a consequence of that bomb. Now, for those who quickly discountenance it and say, oh, it's a highly unlikely proposition, and experts have said the same thing, that it's highly unlikely that Russia would ever stoop so low as to do that. But 2023 is different from the 1960s. And JFK said at the United Nations that the world is, at that time, was hanging under the danger of, for instance, a sword of Damocles. And this sword of Damocles was the threat of nuclear weaponry. And it was either going to happen as a result of an accident, as a result of a deliberate act, or as a result of the acts of madness. So it was very real to them in the 1960s, but the 1960s were closer to the 1940s than 2023. So is it possible that people are taking this issue for granted, and we hear news of it being called saber rattling, it's being called bluffing, he's never going to use them. You've just said as much in your first submission. But do we have the means to say that he's never going to use those weapons? Do we go down that road to say, okay, make good on your threat?
Well, I hope nobody challenges Putin to make good on his threat. You've mentioned the condition when that could happen, either by accident or it was deliberate, or the cause of a madman. I would take that of either an accident or caused by the act of an irrational, mad human being. Those ones we have to occur first before there's deliberate use of nuclear weapon, because you and I understand the principle of mutual self-destruction, which the Russians understand and all the other nuclear powers understand, that there's no one country that has monopoly of those nuclear weapons. This is something that are possessed by quite a dozen other nations. And the idea that one country is going to deliberately use it in 2023 without some repercussion is very, very hard to come by. Any act of deployment of nuclear weapon, even Russia's staunch allies like China have already made it their voice their position well known on that matter, that the use of nuclear weapon will be unacceptable. So I don't think anybody will deliberately use it. I think that will only happen if it was an accident, or Putin somehow became so irrational. But I don't think Putin is an irrational human being to the extent that he's going to use nuclear weapons.
To the counteroffensive now, and the losses being suffered by the Russians. A number of villages have been taken. There's been said that as many as 8 villages have been retaken by the Ukrainians. Do you see the advantage shifting in favor of Ukraine?
Well, in a conflict like this, you have a superpower, because you can, authoritatively say that Russia is a superpower. It's too early to draw a conclusion on how much success the Ukrainians, are making, because one thing is to make those, what is called early rush. And another thing is to be able to sustain it. I don't know how long they'll be able to sustain it, which is the most important thing. No, for them, it's good that they're making some progress, because that is going to help to boost the morale of the troops, which is a very, very vital element in any conflict, is have, a high moral level of your fighting soldiers. Now, to how long or how big that momentum is going to stay on, considering the imbalance in terms of firepower between them and the Russians. You just mentioned how the Russians have been able to use air power to penetrate some of the areas that had been difficult for them up until this time. So I'm sure if there's much success in the use of air power, they will continue to do that until the Ukrainians are able to find a solution to that.
How much of a factor does it come into play for Ukraine to be able to keep up the tempo, as you've mentioned, to have a fighting group that they can sustain the numbers? I'm talking about the numbers of their military people. We see that they're vastly outnumbered by the Russians by way of population, but by way of the army. Do you think they have what it takes to keep up this war, knowing that President Putin says that they've suffered colossal losses and they took those villages at the expense of the loss of many lives?
Yeah, they don't really need to have as large of a military, as the Russians to be successful. They just have to be able to effectively use what they have to counter what the Russians have. It's not mostly by numbers. Number will be a good advantage, but if you have a large number that is largely untrained and ineffective, it's almost as good as not having enough boots on the ground. So the Ukrainians, from what I have seen so far in the course of this conflict, is going to have enough number of troops to be able to prosecute this war. There is that enthusiasm, high enthusiasm level amongst the Ukrainian populations that they are willing to sign up, get trained, and join in the battlefield to defend their country. So having enough boots on the ground, I don't think is going to be an issue for the Ukrainians. What the Ukrainians may be worried about is, the patience of the West that has so far been supporting them in providing them, all the weapons and equipment that they need to continue to prosecute that war. That would be, what would be their worry. But having enough, manpower to be able to continue to prosecute this war is not going to be one of their worries for now.
Okay, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for your contribution this morning. Captain Bish Johnson, retired U.S. Army captain and defense strategist, joined us from Abuja.
Thank you very much, Olumide. I hope I got the name right this time around.
Yeah, you did. It's fine. It's fine. Thank you, Captain Bish. Still to come, U.S. President Joe Biden criticizes Russia's tactical and nuclear deployment to Belarus. Please stay with us. Welcome back to our coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine. Russia says its forces have hit a Ukrainian decision-making center. On June the 16th, they say the armed forces of the Russian Federation launched a group strike with high-precision, long-range sea and air-based weapons at one of the decision-making centers of the armed forces of Ukraine. The target had been achieved. Designated object was hit, according to the Russian Defense Ministry spokesperson at a news conference in Moscow. Separately, the governor of the Bryansk region, which borders Ukraine, says 3 aircraft-type drones attempted a strike on the Druzhba oil refinery facility. Kiev says the death toll from flooding following the destruction of the Kakhovka Dam has risen to 16 in Ukraine, while Russian officials said 29 people have died in territories that Moscow controls. The breaching of the dam on June the 6th unleashed floodwaters across a large swathe of land in southern Ukraine and in Russia-occupied parts of Ukraine, destroying farmland and cutting off supplies to civilians. More than 3,600 people have been evacuated from the flooded areas in Kherson and Mykolaiv, while 31 people were still missing and some 1,300 houses remained flooded, according to the Interior Ministry. The chairman of the Russian-installed administration in the Moscow-occupied parts of Kherson says on Telegram messaging app that the death toll had risen to 29 people. United States President Joe Biden says Russia's deployment of tactical nuclear weapons to Belarus is totally irresponsible. He says in his words, "I've commented on that many times, it's totally irresponsible." Speaking to reporters at a military base near Washington, the U.S. president's comments echoed what Secretary of State Anthony Blinken said a day earlier when he called Belarus' choice to accept the weapons as provocative. British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak will ask entrepreneurs and businesses to step up investment in Ukraine at a conference next week to help it rebuild amidst Russia's invasion. He says Ukraine's bravery on the battlefield shall be matched by the vision of the private sector to help the country rebuild and recover, according to the text of his speech released on Saturday. In his words, a financially stronger, technologically advanced Ukraine will bolster its ability to drive Russia back behind its borders. He spoke to dignitaries and company bosses at the Ukraine Recovery Conference. According to the statement, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky will make a virtual appearance at the two-day event which started in London on Wednesday. Finally, Ukraine says its forces destroyed a significant ammunition depot near the Russian-occupied port city of Henichsk in the southern region of Kherson. It says the armed forces dealt a good blow in the morning and a very loud one in the village of Rikovi, the Henichsk district in the temporarily occupied territory of the Kherson region, according to the spokesperson Serhiy Brachuk for the Odessa military administration. It says there was a very significant ammunition depot and it was destroyed. The UK says Russia and Ukraine suffered a high number of military casualties as Kiev fought to dislodge the Kremlin's forces from occupied areas in the early stages of its counter-offensive. Russian losses are probably at the highest level since the peak of the battle for Bakhmut in March, according to UK military officials in their regular assessment. Now, according to British intelligence, the most intense fighting has centered on the southeastern Zaporizhzhia province, around Bakhmut and further west in Ukraine's eastern Donetsk province. While the update reported that Ukraine was on the offensive in these areas and had made small gains, it says that Russian forces were conducting relatively effective defensive operations in Ukraine's south. Russian luge sliders will remain banned from international events. The ruling body, the FILS, have said, joining several other sports bodies in snubbing recommendations of the International Olympic Committee, IOC, to allow them back. The FIL Congress in Bucharest voted 22-1 in favor of continuing the ban, with 5 abstentions. The FIL says the ban will remain in place as long as the belligerent activities in Ukraine as a reason for this measure continue. It also says, in view of the ongoing war of aggression of the Russian Federation against Ukraine, it has decided to suspend all participation rights of athletes, coaches, trainers, and other officials of the Russian Luge Federation in FIL-sanctioned competition until further notice in order to ensure safe, peaceful sports competitions with integrity. That's our special coverage of Russian invasion of Ukraine today. Thank you for watching. I'm Olumide Macaulay. See you next time, and have a good day.